Okay, guys, good afternoon. I'm going to give you the Frankenstein Context lecture as I promised. I'm going to have to go really fast, so apologies for gabbling my words, okay? Today I'm going to cover the following things. Biographical detail. I'm going to go into the genre, the generic background. I'm going to look at intertextual references, especially Paradise Lost. I'm going to look at the whole idea of Romanticism and how Mary Shelley fits into that. And I'm also going to look at intellectual influences on Mary Shelley, including her parents, okay? Now, I'm sure that most of you know, I'm just going to briefly tell the story, but you can read this. The birth of Frankenstein itself, Mary Shelley was staying with John Polidori and with Byron, Lord Byron, and her husband Percy Shelley in Switzerland. And the weather was absolutely terrible. They'd been reading a lot about galvanism and about other things, and they had a ghost story competition. Polidori came up with one of the first vampire stories, and Mary Shelley told the story of Frankenstein, okay? Her husband and Byron enjoyed it so much they really urged her to continue with it, and a year later the novel Frankenstein was published, okay? She was only 19 years old when it was published, okay? But it brings together many of the thoughts of Romanticism from the time, okay? Now, she had a life of great tragedy, and birth is at the center of a great deal of her life, because Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the most famous feminists in history, died giving birth to Mary Shelley. She died from a poisoned placenta, part of the placenta being left behind. So forever, Mary Shelley felt very guilty because her conception was her mother's death. And miscarriage and ideas of abortion and ideas of birth going wrong are at the center of the novel. She actually, Mary Shelley, in the introduction, refers to the book itself as my hideous progeny. The word progeny meaning child, okay? Here she both introduces the theme of parenting and nurturing that will become of some importance in the novel. And like the monster, the book itself can be seen as stitched together from different fragments, different pieces of narrative. As we know, there's the epistolatory element, the letter elements. There's the framing element of Walton's narrative. And then there is the monster's first-person account, which is refracted through the actual narration of Frankenstein himself. There are also numerous borrowings and allusions, such as Milton's Paradise Lost, which I'll deal with in more detail. Okay, Mary Wollstonecraft was a very strong feminist, and she traveled to France during the French Revolution. She had an affair with a French revolutionary who was actually an American called Gilbert Imlay. She got pregnant outside of marriage. She tried to kill herself by throwing herself off London Bridge. And then later she became one of the biggest, probably the biggest female intellectual in Britain, possibly in Europe, became a very famous writer and wrote a book which I still admire very much today called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. She then married William Godwin. I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. William Godwin was an anarcho-syndicalist, an anarchist. He believed that government was wrong. He wrote a very famous book called An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. He supported the French Revolution very strongly. He supported trade unionism. He was an advocate for workers' rights. He hated the aristocracy.
So what did you say he was again?
I would just say an anarchist would probably be the best term to use. Yeah, he's an anarchist, yeah. And he also wrote a very famous, excellent Gothic novel, probably the best Gothic novel I've ever read, called Caleb Williams. But he used the Gothic genre to reflect upon political injustice. And in that sense, I think he was the first writer to see the potential for using the Gothic genre, which hitherto had just been used to entertain and be a way of telling ghost stories or supernatural stories. Caleb Williams is a highly political novel. So I think Mary Shelley probably had her eye on that and looked at the potential for the Gothic novel to be used to deliver social messages and have an ideological agenda. Her husband was Percy Shelley. He was from an aristocratic background, but he was a very well-known radical. He loathed his time at Eton. Eton was full of fagging, which is a system of bullying and being basically the servant of an older student. He was then expelled from Oxford for writing The Necessity of Atheism. I don't even need to explain that to you. It was so anti-religious. He also wrote anti-monarchical and anti-war poetry. He opposed the Napoleonic Wars. He hated the English government. In particular, he hated the Georgian governments, which went to war with France after the French Revolution. In 1818, he chose to leave England forever, traveling to Italy. And I'll tell you more about the whole idea of exile when I discuss Romanticism. Now, the time that the book was written, and Romanticism, is a time of revolutions. The first revolution is slightly before Romanticism. It's the American War of Independence. But plenty of English radicals supported the American War of Independence. And what did it show? It showed the ability to revolt against a strong power and to choose an idea of freedom and democracy, okay? This was followed then by the French Revolution, which is 1789. Absolutely key date for you, because this injects into Europe new ideas of freedom and social justice. And this is where Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin were writing at this time. Now, clearly the house in which Mary Shelley grows up in is filled with radical ideas, very political ideas, okay? Okay, so Romanticism is a rebellion against the Augustan order that came before it. Whereas the Augustans tended to believe in reason and order, the Romantics prized feeling and intuition. They saw the imagination as the most important faculty of the human mind, not logic. They saw children as sacred to God, as sacred and close to God, okay? This Rousseauian idea that many of you know about. They saw the importance of the poet's inner life, not so interested in the Augustan idea of society and social order. They are more about the individual and the individual state of mind and the individual genius. Now that should occur to you how that theme goes throughout Frankenstein, how Frankenstein isolates himself, how he works in isolation, how individualism is prized above all things, okay? Now, elements of the Gothic novel, I won't go through all of these because you have them before you and you can look at this lecture later, okay? I think many of them you'll know, like the elements of the supernatural. Some of them that are very interesting are the idea of a very tyrannical male figures, often an aristocrat, okay? They're filled, as we know, with overwrought emotion, with women in distress. Women are often threatened by impulsive and tyrannical males. Quite interesting, of course, in Frankenstein, that the victim is a male and not a female. Frankenstein, obviously, is the person who's most oppressed, most victimized, okay? And as you know, that there's a vocabulary associated with the Gothic, which we'll go through, and the frequent use of the sublime, and I'll go through the sublime in more detail in a moment, okay? Now, Shelley, Mary Shelley, I'm talking about, adapts the Gothic genre. And what she does, if I could spell correctly, to my shame, forever this will be on YouTube as an exhibition of how you should check your work, guys. Shelley drew upon contemporary fears to enhance the horror of Frankenstein. In particular, she was familiar with a lot of developments in science. I'm going to suggest to you that a lot of the fears that Frankenstein examines are fears that we have ourselves in the age of 3D printing of organs, in the age when we're cloning or possibly cloning human beings, in the age of genetic modification, that many of the fears of humankind playing God are precisely the fears that Mary Shelley very cleverly taps into. Thus, I'm going to suggest to you that she enriches the Gothic genre and she uses it in a way that hadn't been used before. Also, don't forget that at this time, there are huge advances in medical science, and there is an enormous increase in dissection and the public dissection of bodies and the need for bodies. Medical students more and more are cutting up bodies, and that also then leads to all kinds of public fears. Okay, so one of the things that she talks about is the debate of the life principle. Erasmus Darwin, who is the, I think, great uncle or grandfather of Charles Darwin, of the guy who came up with evolution, he believed that you could develop living organisms from dead matter. So these ideas of creating life were around at the time, okay? You will know that galvanism was around as well. They could make a frog's legs jump, okay? And a third thing that was around was the idea of constructing a body out of parts. So you had scientists putting forward these theories. So it's not like Mary Shelley just pulled them out of thin air. They were contemporary scientific discussions. And of course, because of this, many saw this debate, this life principle debate, as an attack on Christian beliefs. They saw it as destabilizing society. They felt as though we were going into forbidden territory. And in Christianity, as I'm going to show you, there is a long suspicion of scientific knowledge and the idea of new frontiers of knowledge, maybe personified by the figure of Faust, mostly. Grave robbing became very popular because it was actually worth quite a lot of money. You could actually make money by digging up graves and stealing corpses, and indeed there were lots of documentary examples of people robbing graves, okay, and it became a source of horror stories. So I want you to see that Mary Shelley is eclectically drawing off many facts of the day when she writes Frankenstein. Luigi Galvani, as you all know very famously, would demonstrate the frog's legs jumping, and this horrified people because it seemed to indicate that you could infuse life into dead matter. And so Mary Shelley very cleverly uses that idea. You'll all remember that in the chapter where the monster comes to life, it is through galvanism, okay? And here we have a beautiful picture of Mont Blanc. Mary Shelley was very good at using the romantic obsession with Sublime. And in Frankenstein, there are quite a number of exotic settings, including Ireland, the Orkney Isles. Frankenstein obviously travels as well to the Arctic region, doesn't he, where we end. And Mont Blanc is maybe the most famous setting for the confrontation between the beast and Frankenstein. This is a picture by Friedrich Casper, I believe his name is, called The Wanderer. And I choose it because it is the zeitgeist picture of Romanticism. By zeitgeist, I mean the absolute spirit of Romanticism. The idea of the lonely artist up in the cloudy mountains away from human society, looking at this awesome, sublime landscape that defies anything that mankind can do. So you'll see this kind of landscape throughout the works of the Romantics. Percy Shelley's work, Byron's work, and many others. The egotistical sublime is the idea that the artist can only reach the highest point of his being alone, okay? The 18th century idea, the Augustan idea before that, was that the town was the ideal place where people were civilized and educated. But the Romantics rejected the town, and they were in favor of these desolate, more Gothic-like landscapes, okay? So the Sublime is really interesting because it basically redefines the attraction of terror. And the guy who writes a philosophical inquiry into the origins of the Sublime, Burke, actually talks about the fact that we enjoy being dwarfed by nature, being made to seem small, and this idea that the nobility of nature in a way could inspire us. So you'll notice in Gothic fiction and Romanticism in general, they're usually huge, lofty castles and landscapes that dwarf mankind, that make mankind less important, that make mankind's achievements seem futile and trivial, and nature to seem bigger. In our poem, The Prelude, you remember that with Wordsworth? We have the same thing, don't we? With the storm overtaking the boy, and the scariness and the vastness and the enormity of nature. So the exotic locations he often uses ideas of inhuman, cold and isolated places, places that are hostile to mankind, glaciers, the Orkney, etc. And there's often a use of pathetic fallacy, okay? In Frankenstein, there's use of the pathetic fallacy with the weather reflecting Victor's internal grief, internal turmoil, and the emergence of the monstrous within him. The second generation of Romantics, that is Lord Byron, Shelley, Keats, all died very young and away from home. They chose exile, and you can see that, can't you, in Frankenstein. He chooses exile, doesn't he? He goes to Ingolstadt, doesn't he? He leaves Lake Geneva behind, doesn't he? He also chooses exile in the Orkney Islands, etc., and in remote Ireland as well. So there's this strong motif of escape from social ties and community. Now, of course, one of the interesting things is, and this is what I'm going to suggest to you, is that Mary Shelley actually has Frankenstein punished for that rejection, though, doesn't she? The fact that he actually abandons his family and his kith and kin is part of the reason why he gets himself into so much trouble. So rather than seeing Frankenstein as a straightforward use of romantic imagery, you might also see it as a critique of it. Intertextual references. These are references to other very famous texts, okay? Well, one of the things I'm going to suggest to you is that using very intellectual intertextual references actually elevates the genre. What do I mean by elevates? I mean it makes it seem more intellectual. And the Gothic genre was seen as quite a trashy genre. Novels in 1790 were seen as vastly inferior to poetry. They were seen as the stuff that servant girls would read, etc. They lacked status as a genre. One of the ways you could get round this was by having very highbrow references to Milton and to Shakespeare. That's what Anne Radcliffe did. She was the most famous Gothic novelist at the time. Frankenstein is filled with these. There are lots of allusions to the Bible, to the myth of Faust, to Paradise Lost, to Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and to Greek mythology, to Prometheus, etc. You'll all know that the subtitle of the novel is The Modern Prometheus. And in Greek mythology, Prometheus was the Titan who stole fire and gave it to mankind. And of course, for this, he gets punished in a hideous way. Here is a picture of the eagle tearing out his liver, and every day this would be a ritual that happened. The eagle would eat his liver as he screamed and watched, and then the liver would regenerate, and so it would happen again and again. So it's this idea of eternal torment, okay? Who's punished by the gods. Now that actually in many ways is a very interesting intertextual reference, because it seems to warn against transgression. So is Frankenstein actually a cautionary tale reminding humankind to keep their place? We could read it in that way, couldn't we, as a conservative text, saying, don't step out of place, don't try and take God's possessions, etc. Frankenstein is punished in this way. Milton's Paradise Lost, okay? Wonderful, wonderful poem, incredible if any of you ever want to read it, but hard going, I do have to warn you, okay? It tells the story from the beginning. It tells the pre-story of the Bible, of how Satan rebels against God, etc. And then, of course, it tells the story of mankind rebelling against God, okay? Now, Milton wrote this Paradise Lost to celebrate God. He was a devout Christian, etc. But the interesting thing is that when the Romantics read Milton, they actually sympathized with the devil. And they sympathized with the devil because they actually saw the devil as a rebel like themselves, okay? And the most famous quote comes from William Blake, who said, the reason that Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and gods, and at liberty when he wrote of devil and hell, is because he was a true poet of the devil's party without knowing it. And it's like a lot of films, you know, where the villain is more interested than the goodie, because the villain has a kind of glamour attached to him of rebellion, etc. So the rebels, the Romantics, went on the side of Satan, and they actually saw God as an oppressive, autocratic ruler. And this is maybe something that we see in the monsters narrative when he confronts Frankenstein, okay? You guys will know the story of Adam and Eve, and the idea, of course, is that it's knowledge that causes us to fall in the Bible. Eve, over here, rather inappropriately, I've got a naked picture, I need to maybe watch out for that. Eve sins first and takes the fruit from the tree of knowledge. And of course, as you can see in the second picture, then Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Paradise, and that is in the book of the Bible called Exodus. And that's a word that we use today, Exodus, isn't it, to be thrown out. In Paradise Lost, book 10, we have the line which is the epigraph to the novel. Did I request thee, maker, from my clay to mould me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? It's an incredible line where Adam actually turns on God and says, you know, look at the way you treated me. I didn't ask to be born. I didn't ask to be made. I didn't know this was going to happen. And it's, you know, quite a extraordinary moment because it could be read as very blasphemous. Now, this seems to me to be one of the key ideas in Frankenstein, because this is precisely what the monster is going to say to Frankenstein, isn't it? And as we know in chapter 10, he says, I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel. So he's saying, I'm actually Satan. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because if you think about it, in the Bible, there's some justification for Exodus, isn't there? There is a transgression. But in the case of Frankenstein, the monster did nothing wrong, did he? And in fact, if you look at the passage when the monster is born, he wrinkles his lips and like a baby, he tries to smile at his daddy, doesn't he? But so there is no sin. And Frankenstein casts him out. So he's almost a more harsh version of God, yeah? In the first confrontation, the monster laments, I must be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things. Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by annihilation of one of us. Everywhere I see bliss from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. My soul glowed with love and humanity. But am I not alone, miserably alone? Very interesting retelling of the story of Adam and Eve, isn't it? Now, I'm going to move on to Rime of the Ancient Mariner, an epic poem by Samuel Coleridge Taylor. Coleridge was in the first generation of Romantics, along with William Wordsworth, okay? It's an incredible story which tells the tale of a sailor who kills an albatross for no reason. And after that, all kinds of supernatural events occur, and he is punished. And he is cursed forever for the rest of his life. At a certain time of the day, he will stop, and he has to accost a traveler, hold him by the hand, and tell his story to them. Tell his story of transgression and how he was punished as a result of this, yeah? It's too late for Frankenstein, isn't it, in the novel, by the time he tells his story as the Ancient Mariner. But Walden can learn from the story, can't he, and turn back and not kill the albatross. And here is a little bit from the poem. He holds him with his glittering eye. The wedding guest stood still, and listens like a 3 years child. The mariner hath his will. The wedding guest sat on a stone, he cannot choose but hear. And thus spake on the ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. And you can see from my little picture there, there's a picture of the mariner holding the wedding guest and telling him his story. I'm going to suggest to you that's the same dynamic as Walden and, Captain Walton and of Frankenstein, okay? Faust is the next guy I'm going to deal with. He's the protagonist of a classic German legend. He's a scholar who's very successful, but he's dissatisfied with his life. He seems to represent the spirit of inquiry, of enlightenment, of a world in which mankind needs to know everything, okay? And to this end, he makes a pact with the devil, and in this pact he exchanges his soul for unlimited knowledge and worldly pleasures. Well, Frankenstein certainly doesn't choose worldly pleasures. He doesn't choose beautiful maidens and seduction and orgies and great times, does he? He actually has a really sad, ascetic, monk-like existence. But he does go for the ultimate knowledge thing, doesn't he? So the Enlightenment. What is the Enlightenment? It's a period of history that is characterized by dramatic revolutions in science, philosophy, and politics, okay? It is a move away from the medieval world in which you knew your place and you just read the scriptures. So it's about the restless energy of inquiry and the new directions that science take. In England, its most famous proponent was Francis Bacon, who talked about the need to invent a new kind of science. That was then taken up by people like Isaac Newton, okay? Now, of course, this was seen as very revolutionary, very dynamic, very interesting, but it terrified the hell out of people as well, because it questioned everything. So the world was no longer solid. People didn't just accept their place and know God and know what truth was. This was a world in which all assumptions were being undermined. And this seems to me the spirit of Frankenstein, isn't it? A guy who wants to go into new regions, new frontiers, and change all of our assumptions. However, we also know the occult appears in Frankenstein, doesn't it? So there's a curious blending, isn't there, of the new science of the Enlightenment and the occult, which is the idea of Paracelsus, Cornelius Agrippa, and Albertus Magnus. And Frankenstein's initial interest in science and the world comes out of the occult, doesn't it? Out of this desire to find out how to get, the lodestone or the secrets of life, etc. So it's quite interesting that Mary Shelley draws off both major Western traditions, the supernatural and the modern science. So the striving for the new is a very important theme in the novel. This is seen through science, but it's also seen through imperialism, and it's also seen through adventure. As Mary Shelley writes, Britain is expanding as a colonial power. They've lost America, but they've moved on to India, and their empire is expanding. Now, one of the ways of reading Frankenstein is to see it as a critique of imperialism, isn't it? Of this restless desire to go out there. What is Walton if not an imperialist adventurer? A person who needs new challenges and new territory to conquer, etc. Now, of course, this destabilizes the world in many ways, and it also directs people away from the domestic affections, the love of family, the love of community. It prizes an idea of adventurer individualism. And in the book, both Walton and Frankenstein put themselves in danger and peril by rejecting domesticity and the local and favoring the exotic and the idea of faraway climes. Ingolstadt is another place I want to speak to you about, because it was a perfect setting. It was perhaps the greatest medical university in Europe, but it was also the home of the order of the Illuminati. The Illuminati were reported to be a secret society founded in Ingolstadt, and their members were known to favor free thinking and radical politics. Okay, so Frankenstein goes to this kind of hotbed of new politics and new ideas. Remember, the ideas of the French Revolution are circulating at the time. Conservative people will see these ideas as very dangerous, as very subversive. Polar exploration was a topic of some interest at the time when Mary Shelley was writing, and she probably read about polar expeditions that were going. Okay? Shelley did not use the narrative framework of the meeting with Walton for her first draft. Okay? It only came later, and as I've said here, this scenario may well have been added after she read accounts of the failed polar expeditions in articles by Sir John Barrow in 1817. So you notice that came later, and it's worth seeing, isn't it? So I want you to see that Mary Shelley changed the script quite a lot, and she was very good at using contemporary details. She used the news. So I wanted you to see how she expanded the Gothic genre. It wasn't a formulaic use of the Gothic genre. She really expanded it to be political and topical. Walton, do you understand this feeling? This breeze which has travelled from the regions toward which I'm advancing gives me a foretaste of those icy climes. Inspirited by this wind of promise, my daydreams become more fervent and vivid. The die is cast, I have consented to return, if we are not destroyed. Thus my hopes are blasted by cowardice and indecision. Notice the contrast between these two quotes. One is of the amazing world of opportunity, etc. The other one is of defeat, isn't it? Okay? Well, I'm going to leave you to decide what the message of Frankenstein is, because Walton, when he turns back, sees himself as a coward and defeated. But the reader might be inclined to see him as making the right decision. And I think that you could see that as the whole purpose of Mary Shelley's writing. Now, the great moral debate. This is really important, okay? The life of man, Thomas Hobbes wrote, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In the state of nature, Hobbes believed that people were horrible, vicious, brutish, they killed each other, they were scum cavemen. What we needed to do was civilize, move forward, okay, and get out the jungle. Now, this concept of civilization, as I say here, is tied to ideas of urban progress, isn't it? Who challenges that? We know him, don't we? Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He actually says that childhood is a state of innocence. He says that the state of nature is the perfect state. He says that civilization is rubbish and that it corrupts people and puts them in chains. And he actually says that he's one of the people who is credited with coming up with the idea of the noble savage. That the dude who lives in the bush is actually better than the guy who lives in the city. That the city is corrupting us, okay? And I think we can see these ideas in Frankenstein, don't you? Firstly, we can see them with the de Lacy family. Even though they're expelled and live in poverty, they are actually incredibly harmonious, aren't they? We're meant to see them as a wonderful family, aren't we? They look after the old blind patriarch of the family, don't they? They find happiness. You'll notice they play guitar and sing and read, etc. It's seen as a simple, folksy, homely way of living, which is the romantic ideal, inspired by Rousseau, okay? De Lacy tells the monster that the hearts of men, when unprejudiced by any obvious self-interest, are full of brotherly love and charity. Now, this is an idea we still have today, guys, isn't it? If you go on your Facebook, sometimes you'll see like a black kid embracing a white kid of 2 years old. And usually the message is, people are naturally good and not racist. And that we make them racist, okay? Now, that's a very modern idea, because the traditional Christian idea is that we were born full of sin and evil and bad. And the idea of the baptism is we wash away the sins and horror of people. Now, if we think about the monster is an unbaptized good person, isn't he? A Rousseauian noble savage. And here's a picture just reminding you of the blind father happily playing the guitar to his children, okay? Now, evil from without and evil from within. Now, traditionally, I've told you this in the Gothic novel, evil is from without, isn't it? It's something that threatens you. But the more sophisticated elements of the Gothic genre show that evil partly comes from within. If we think of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or we think about the vampire Dracula biting you, the evil goes inside you then, doesn't it? Or the alien thing. So the idea of self and other is actually complicated in Frankenstein. And it actually goes hand in hand with the idea of the double. We know that Walton is the double of Frankenstein. Some people talk about the monster as the double of Frankenstein as well, don't they? Okay. So Frankenstein looks forward to more impressive, more sophisticated ideas of the Gothic, like the picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, in which Dorian's portrait ages and he doesn't, okay? Also Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, in which Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are not two separate people. They're one and the same person, aren't they? And so I won't say too much about the noble savage. You can read about that, and I think I've covered that, okay? The important thing is that the Rousseauian idea is that sympathy is the natural state of man. And I'm going to leave these quotes for you to look at home. You'll see the monster is naturally sympathetic. He's a good guy. He chops firewood for the people, doesn't he? He has to learn to be bitter and twisted and angry. And if you wanted a Marxist or a political reading, you could see the monster as a working class. You could see him as laboring for people and only getting angry and twisted and wanting to revolt like the French revolutionaries when he is treated so badly over and over again. And you notice even his demand, you must create a female for me with whom I can live in the interchange of those sympathies necessary for my being. He doesn't say I want a female to have sex with, does he? He says I want to have a female to sympathize. I need sympathy. He uses that word. And I think this humanization of the other, I've told you, is the core genius of Frankenstein as a novel, okay? The monster's reading is really interesting. He reads Plutarch's The Lives of the Great Grecians and Romans. Now, why do a lot of radicals like Shelley like the Greeks and the Romans? Because they rejected monarchy, didn't they? They had an idea of the republic, and they had sort of nascent ideas of democracy. He reads Goethe, The Sorrows of Young Werther. Werther is a young man who rejects society and who in the end kills himself and believes in living honestly and truly. He also reads Milton's Paradise Lost. Milton's Paradise Lost is incredibly important because it gives him that sympathy with Satan, doesn't it? You know what I mean? Not that he's a Satanist, but that he rebels against an autocratic creator that treats him too harshly, or so he feels. Remember I said to you in later editions, that element of the narrative is played down. As Mary Shelley gets older, so she doesn't want the radical anti-religious sentiment to come across so much. The French Revolution, okay, I told you, 1789 to 1799. Well, most of the Romantics supported the revolution. They liked the ideas of equality, fraternity, and what's the other one? Liberty, equality, fraternity, isn't it, yeah? But do you notice in the book, Mary Shelley shows France to be very corrupt. Do you remember that? Sapphi's father was sentenced to death unfairly. Do you remember that? What happens when the de Lacys help him? Well, Felix then has to fly the country, doesn't he? Sapphi's father then betrays Felix. Do you remember this? And I said that there's quite a negative kind of representation of Islam in the book, isn't there? That Sapphi has to run away and her father is going to force her into a marriage that she doesn't want, etc. And so I think that we see in France, you see that second generation of Romantics. The French Revolution is seen as quite corrupt and quite autocratic by this time. Everything has gone wrong. So whereas the early Romantics like Wordsworth supported the revolution, the second generation of Romantics begin to realize that the revolution's being corrupted. And you'll notice one of the themes is the tyranny of mob justice. We see this on two main occasions, don't we? Do you remember when Justine is on trial? Do you remember the mob scream for her blood, etc.? And Justine is then publicly executed. Do you remember? And everyone cheers and are happy. The representations of justice in the book are almost always terrible, aren't they? You'll remember also Frankenstein's arrest in Ireland. Do you remember the mob all have him arrested? So this idea of mob justice, of kangaroo justice, is seen as very dangerous. And this idea of vigilante justice is a common theme going wrong in the book, yeah? So, in conclusion, okay, I think that Frankenstein is an amazing book. I think it's an incredible book because it plays out many of the great debates of the day. New scientific discoveries, ideas of politics, ideas of whether man is good or not. What are the limits of human knowledge, okay? What's the place of community and of society? And how far can the individual rebel and give those up? It draws upon the archetype of Faust, as I said to you, of the great knowledge seeker. And in the West, it's very interesting because we both love the knowledge seeker, but also fear them, don't we? Nearly all of our stories are about the destructiveness of science, aren't they? And if you think about the archetype of the evil scientist, how many movies do we go and see in the science fiction genre where some kind of scientific experiment goes wrong? And it goes wrong because the arrogance of the chief scientist and his overwhelming need to pursue his experiments at all costs, and how they go on to destroy us. And so what I'm going to suggest to you is that, and what I'd like you to write about in the exam, is to show an appreciation for how Mary Shelley creates a much more sophisticated idea of the Gothic genre. In many ways, she could be credited for inventing science fiction as well. Science fiction because the actual experiments are not just ghosts and monsters and things like that, are they? They're actually rooted in an idea of verisimilitude, of probability, and they show reading of the times, of scientific theory, etc. There's a lot of amazing, beautiful writing in the book, isn't there, as well? Especially of many of the landscapes. And there's a lot of drama and melodrama in Frankenstein's journey, etc. But I think most of all, and I think I taught you a whole lesson on this, I think she gives speech to the other. Rather than making the monstrous monstrous, she actually says, what have we created here? Is there a rationale to the other? Do we just see it as a speechless thing that attacks us? You know, in the way that maybe Godzilla is. a very poor example, isn't it, of the other just as like a ridiculous nihilistic beast that destroys us without reason. I think if we look at good versions of King Kong, those are ones that show the monster being abused, aren't they? Those are the ones in which the anger that's visited on society is actually highly justified. Where do they get those stories from? They get those stories from Frankenstein. What's the genius of Frankenstein? It creates a whole multitude of narratives which are still used today. Maybe that's the kind of point you should be looking to make in your conclusions. Khalas.